Toni Morrison, thanks so much for joining me here today at the New York Public Library. We're going to be talking about your book, A Mercy, your new book. It's a fascinating look at America in its earliest days when it was still the New World. You return to the subject of slavery, but in a very different way and in a very different era. We're talking about, as I said, the New World. This is really the early times in America. Why did you choose to go to that era to tell this story?
I wanted to separate race from slavery, to see what it was like, what it might have been like to be a slave, but not without being raced, because I couldn't believe that that was the natural state of people who were born and people who came here, that it had to be constructed, planted, institutionalized, and legalized. So I moved as far back as I was able when what we now call America was fluid, ad hoc, a place where countries from all over the world were grabbing at land and resources, and all sorts of people were coming here.
And you have this tapestry of characters, and each of these characters seems to sort of represent a different aspect of life in America at that time, and a different kind of servitude and unpaid labor.
Oh yes, one realizes that there was no civilization that did not rest on some form of enslavement, whether it was Athens or Moscow, or whether it was England or France. They called them different names, peons, serfs, what have you. But owning the labor of people was a constant in the world. So that was not the unusual thing. The unusual thing was coupling it with racism, which came much, much later. So for me, it was the ideal place to see how all of this began.
Let me ask you about Jacob Burke, that character. At the beginning of the book, when you first introduce him, and during that journey that he takes, at a certain point you mention what the atmosphere is like in the country at that time, and you talk about a people's war, and the result of that people's war is that laws were created which separated white people forever, I think you put it, from everybody else. And I don't know anything about that. Tell me what.
Well, I had always heard about, it's called Bacon's Rebellion, and it was a group of men led by a landed gentry person, aristocrat, who gathered together white indentured servants, black slaves, other landed gentry, about 400 or 500 of them, in order to overthrow the governor in Virginia, for all sorts of reasons. They also rampaged through the Carolinas, killing Native Americans as well. But at any rate, that was this interesting mix of slave, free, indentured, and wealthy, who seemed to have the same purpose. And they were successful in the overthrow. And of course, the governor came back from England. They were all caught and hanged, etc. But the consequence of that, of a group that was not defined by race, status, or class, attacking the powers that be, was so horrible that they rewrote several laws and added some. But for me, the pertinent ones were any white could maim or kill any black for any reason and not be prosecuted. And that was the classic split, because even if your interests as servants or indentured people or just poor farmers were the same as the Africans or the African Americans, you would not join with them because you had this little perk, which was whiteness, which is a construction in order to divide, particularly poor people. And it has operated pretty much throughout the history of the country, where people with the same economic interests are divided because of the friction that has been laid down. And the people who benefit are the people who own everything.
And that's the moment when it happened in this country, you think?
That's a moment.
A moment.
And that's very
One of the
early.
first.
That's 1673. 1678, before he's even there, in Virginia. And that kind of thing spread because it was profitable and useful, and it protected landed gentry because they could divide and conquer.
I wanted to ask you about the writing of this book, because it's beautifully written. And what's most interesting about it in many ways is that each story builds on the other. That at the beginning you're not entirely sure what's going on, and it takes a while, really maybe into the second chapter, before you really understand what Florin's story is all about. As you're reading about Jacob, you learn more about Florin's story.
And him.
And then in the next, when you read Lena's story, then that fills in more details, and on throughout the book. Why did you write it that way, in that sort of layered kind of way?
Well, the structure was absolutely the meaning as well as the hardest part of any novel. But this one, I wanted her to be on a journey, going somewhere important, and I wanted her voice, which would cut into the other voices. So she's first person and present tense, to give it the immediacy. Everybody else is third person, but they have to not only be who they are and what they want and what their circumstances are, but they have to move that story a little bit. So you're never out of the track. You're never away from the gun that's shooting toward the end, but at the same time, you can pause and look around you and see who these people are and learn their relationships, because they really are an interesting collection of, as Lena says, orphans, really, who make a life in one of the few places where you could have all these extraordinary people come together and belong together.
Right. Because at one point they almost come together as a family.
Absolutely.
Rebecca, who is Jacob's wife, and Lena, the young Native American woman, they're almost like sisters. They're certainly friends.
Right.
But it's so ephemeral, and it can't hold together.
And even that young girl, Sorrow, who is a little bit apart from everybody, but they can absorb her. The indentured servants who don't live there, they work there. They like those people. It's a little society that they have created in the wilderness. And it works until it doesn't.
But why doesn't it? Why can't it? What is it about?
Well, I wanted this group to be sort of the earliest version of American individuality, American self-sufficiency. And I think I wanted to show the dangers of that. You really do need a community. You do need a structure, whether it's a church or a religion, as Rebecca thinks, or whether it's just belonging to a military unit or belonging to a tribe. There's no outside thing that holds them together. They would not have missed it had the master had lived. But if you have to, if you have one peg that's holding it all together, then you see how vulnerable you are if you don't have this outside thing, which is tribal or racial or religious or institutional or just, colleagues and workers to hold it together when other things disappear. But that's the tension. Then, in an ad hoc world, and it's a tension now, how to be an individual in yourself and how to adore privacy and at the same time belong to something larger than you are. And that tension is always going to be there, always.
Well, thanks so much. It was wonderful talking with you.
This is delightful.
We've been talking with the writer Toni Morrison about her new book, A Mercy.